Hello and welcome to the show Beyond the Journal, where we will discuss social media, digital education, and current controversies in cancer and medicine. I'm Dr. Jack West, the Associate Clinical Professor in Medical Oncology at the City of Hope Cancer Center in the Los Angeles area. And I'm happy to be joined today by my co-host, Dr. Charu Aggarwal, who is the Leslie M. Heisler Associate Professor of Lung Cancer Excellence at University of Pennsylvania's Abramson Cancer Center in Philadelphia. Hello, Charu.
Hi, Jack. And today we are pleased to have with us Dr. Nora Disis, who's the Helen B. Sloanaker Endowed Professor for Cancer Research. She's the Professor of Medicine at University of Washington, as well as Editor-in-Chief for JAMA Oncology. Welcome, Nora.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Thanks. So let's just get started. And it's been really exciting being part of JAMA Oncology, where I'm a web editor since its inception. I think it was 2014, and you've been the editor-in-chief since then. But over all this time, and even before that, the number of journals in oncology or broadly in medicine has grown over time, and yet there still is clearly a role for many new journals. How important do you think it is for JAMA Oncology, and how are you framing it in terms of having a sense of a personality, a brand, a concept of what the style would be entering into the landscape that already had a bunch of other cancer journals in it, going back to 2014 as it was getting off the ground, Nora?
That's a great question. In fact, when the journal was launching, I got a lot of emails from people saying the last thing we need is another journal. What is happening here? When I was approached by Howard Bachner at JAMA to initiate JAMA Oncology, I think one of the biggest things that the journal really needed was a personality to be able to make it in this crowded field. And one of the things that I personally really wanted from the journal was, if there was only one journal you could read, that journal would be JAMA Oncology. And what I wanted it to be was a journal that everything in there had a meaning for cancer care, either immediately or within the next 5 years. And so what that did is it allowed us to really blow out the type of content that we could have, meaning a really interesting, potentially important, very early biomarker paper might be something that we would consider. Versus, I think we were one of the first journals that started publishing on financial toxicity and many different economic papers in cancer. So we really spanned the whole gamut, but through that lens that if I, as a practicing oncologist, don't think that this is important, then it's not going to get into JAMA Oncology. I think another benefit for JAMA Oncology is that the journal is very diverse. So about 50% of what we publish is original research, but the other 50% is opinion, reviews, clinical challenges, and that also makes it very, very appealing. So I do think that JAMA Oncology has been able to find its place. It certainly had an amazing debut impact factor, and the impact factor today is, 24.8. So it's something that people read and it resonates with our audience.
Can I just ask about what kind of feedback do you get, either in terms of outreach or input, fan mail, or just information from the views, the downloads, in terms of what resonates most with readers?
So I think the most common comment that I get is I love JAMA Oncology because when I get it, I see a paper that I really have to read. But then as I go through the table of contents, I see a lot of other things that I want to read too. And if it was one word that people say to all of us again and again and again, and you've heard this, Jack, is that JAMA Oncology is edgy. And I think that JAMA Oncology is kind of edgy. You're going to find papers in JAMA Oncology that you don't see in other journals. We published the first report of a specific prehistoric cancer, which got a massive amount of downloads. So we do publish things that I think other journals might look at and say, well, that's not really in our wheelhouse. But our wheelhouse is what would be interesting to our readership. And, I think with the diversity of our article types as well, we do have these little short briefs that we can publish called research letters. And I think in those research letters, you see an absolute ton of creativity.
There have been many challenges, and there has been an increase in digital consumption. We see this with sharing of articles on platforms such as Twitter. And we're also seeing JAMA Oncology actually adapt to this already by, coming out with new articles and quote unquote a new issue every week. However, the print journal is still, once a month. Do you think this will change over time? Or I guess the print journal is less than once a month. You can correct me on that. And how do you see the online platform changing in terms of how we as a community consume new research?
So first, let's talk about the print issue. I think over time, we're going to see print journals go away. I mean, I think that's just the nature of the beast. They still hang around for two reasons. We're coming toward the end of an audience that prefers to read in print. And I'll give you a good example of this. We let people write letters to the editor, but they have to come in during a certain period after publication. And we call publication the online publication. The print issue lags behind the online publication. And so we often get letters to the editor where they're responding to the print edition because that's how that reader reads. They read the print. And I can't take their letter to the editor because it's like months after the original publication of the article. So we do have, I'm generalizing and say they're probably older readers who grew up reading paper and they like reading paper. And I think that that's a group of readers that are coming toward the end of their career. And so we have people now where they prefer to read things online. They just don't read things in print anymore. What's a little bit more worrisome to me is how people want the information pre-digested. And I think that that's one of the beauties of science, is to be able to read an article filled with the data and make your own decision on whether you believe it or not, right? And there's a lot of papers that I read where I read the conclusion and there's no way that that data is allowing you to make that conclusion. But very, very often now, we're seeing readers, and I'll generalize them as being younger, where they may get all their information about what they read off social media rather than looking at that tagline and going back to the article and making their own decision. And I think journals like JAMA Oncology or any of the JAMA Network journals where the bar is very high, I mean, that paper that's making a conclusion that's not supported by the data would never get through our review. But there's lots and lots of journals where it would. And so I am a little bit concerned as scientific and especially medical information goes out into the world through multiple different channels, really pre-digested for the reader, that people might do some decision-making based on information that's not accurate.
Yeah, that's interesting that it's changing in some ways, not for the better, that people are not developing their own skill set in terms of how to review the data critically, but just want to be told what's the take home of that. It's also interesting. I remember when you and others explained that we should get off the mindset that this comes out as a monthly issue because it's really new content every week, and that's what it really has come to be. But as things move away from print and toward more online, some of our restrictions and historical conventions go away in terms of being limited by page counts. You know, we have JAMA Network Open, and there's other online journals that just do not have concerns about page counts. And do you see that could free up new ways of doing things, where we could have more accompanying editorials to help provide context, or are we going to still be limited just by how much can be well edited in advance, at a regular pace?
I think that what I would like to see is more restrictions, to be honest with you. So, for example, we have these article formats called research letters and brief reports. A brief report is a very short paper, 2,000 words, 3 tables and figures. I have to be honest, because I read many papers a day. There isn't a paper that can't be written in 2,000 words and 3 figures. I don't care what it is. It can be a randomized phase 3 clinical trial, etc. What worries me more is that pre-digested issue we talked about before. Making papers longer, no one's going to read them. We can make papers much shorter. People like to do data dumps in papers. We get papers where they've got 25 supplemental figures. We don't need that. They're just putting stuff out there because they generated it and they don't know how to edit themselves. If we made every paper 3 pages long with 3 tables and figs, then we'll have people reading the paper in a format that they want to read, in something that they can read. So I would love to publish more, but I would love to have the papers be short, make their 2 take-home points, have the data show those take-home points, and let the reader actually look at the data. So I think we're all going to go to online content. Eventually, it's going to be online content delivered every single day. But I think what we also have to do is adapt the way we put together science to meet the needs of our readers now. And, we're still operating like it was 25 years ago with these, 5 or 6 page long 7-figure papers. There's too much information coming out right now for us to be able to sit down and read 50 pages a day. You just can't. And I would say when you look at a lot of papers, as an editor, there's so much in there that is ancillary, that muddles the story rather than supports the story. So I think we need to teach people a new way to present their ideas.
That's really interesting. And I think the research letters and brief reports are paving the way towards that. And it's actually very interesting to hear you say that 50% or more of your content is focused on other reports, not just original investigative reports. So that's interesting. One of the challenges in 2020 has, of course, been the pandemic. And I wanted to ask you and, your team, how challenging has it been to glean through the multiple submissions you must have received on the topic of COVID-19 and cancer, especially early on in the pandemic when we didn't really have a lot of trials, a lot of data? Was there pressure on you as the editor-in-chief, as well as the editorial team, to accept and, move these articles to production faster, to stay current and stay relevant, sometimes not even having enough time to do a systematic peer review or, have pressures because everybody was struggling? And how do you even find reviewers at that time?
I do have to say our submissions went up 50%. So we were receiving tons of COVID papers. I desperately wanted to publish them, but reading them, I could not do so. People were incredibly descriptive. And so they were showing a snapshot in time. I mean, the papers that came in really were, we're in this clinic. This is how many COVID positive patients we have, usually less than 50. Here are their clinical characteristics. No, it was not useful information. And sometimes, again, getting back to that issue of people providing this information and then making sweeping conclusions about it, it would have been detrimental for us to publish some of the papers that came in. People saying things like patients on chemotherapy are more likely to get COVID. Then I'd get a paper saying COVID has nothing to do with patients being on chemotherapy. And you can't, people were so desperate for any information. It really became a sense of protecting the patients, really, with some of these papers that came in. I mean, we'd circulate them around as editors. Jack has seen several of them where we'd be like, we can't publish this. The methods used were incorrect. There weren't adjustment for multiple variables. Recently, even our statistician, wrote an editorial about how to glean through all this COVID data and what the major things are you need to look for in a paper. But I understand authors, especially those that were in COVID hotspots, wanting to really get out as much information as they possibly can. But I think in the rush to get this information out, thoughts about quality and analysis kind of went down the drain. We didn't feel pressure from anyone to publish their articles. I mean, we had a lot of people rebut, and I would always go back to them and tell them why the paper wasn't published. But we did rush them to publication, meaning at the time they were accepted, when they went into our post-production period, those papers took precedence in getting published. Mm-hmm. And the JAMA network gave us the opportunity to publish them out of cycle. So if we thought the paper was really important, they would even publish it in the middle of the week. One thing we did not do is we did not change our review process. Our review process generally takes about 2 weeks, and we don't do rapid reviews because we think it's more important to have an outstanding review of the paper than one that's done quickly and is not complete.
Do you think that there has been any significant, either temporary or more lasting, damage to the academic publishing field in the wake of retractions and expedited publications, which, there was a frantic urge for timely information. Did that, if not JAMA Oncology and in other settings, I don't know about undermine, but at least compromise the lasting integrity of the field?
I think the more there are retractions, obviously, the more it undermines that particular journal. Retractions, you can't help but have retractions. Sometimes there are people in the field who will take a data set and really do a complete new analysis on it and come up with something that they've seen that's been an error that's very difficult to catch, that even a reviewer wouldn't catch, and is an honest error by the author. Some of the things that are more disturbing are when people make up data, or, there was a huge database that people were using to write papers about COVID from that wasn't really up to snuff in terms of how it was put together. And these are things that I think are very critical errors that potentially could have been caught and were caught by a different level of review. So I do think I'm not a fan of the rapid review. I don't think any of the journals in the JAMA network are fans of rapid review, and we certainly don't do that. But I think those journals that choose to do that, the editor, I think it's on the editor to take those reviews in and treat that paper with more care, almost doing their own review as well, to make sure that the quality of the data that's going out there is at the highest level.
One of the other evolving stories in oncology is a movement toward more and more granular molecular oncology. And I know you have feelings about N of one kind of work, interesting case studies that come in that really struggle with, it's interesting, but it's not necessarily generalizable. And you have cited the benefit of JAMA Oncology reaching a broad audience. How do you balance the timeliness and the current trend of more and more narrow focus in molecular subtyping with trying to have work that is going to be broadly useful to people and not just N of one case studies?
Yeah. I think, obviously I'm a zero fan of N of one case studies, and JAMA Oncology doesn't publish those. We do not publish case studies. I would say in general, if you come in with a series of less than 10 patients, it's very hard to make it past me in terms of getting that published. So I'm really a stickler on, if we're going to publish something, it's probably true. So that's my rule of thumb. If it's probably true, then I'm interested in moving it forward to a review. And I can't say that with N of one studies. And who knows how many N's there were for them to find the N of one that made that. And I've been privy in my lifetime as a scientist and a clinician of seeing a study that was very focused on a particular type of cancer get published as an N of one study, where the final publication of the N of 20 study was an absolute negative study, except for the one patient. And that always made me cringe a little bit, because the one patient got into a very high-ranking journal, and the final study would usually go to a journal that not very many people read. And so that's lost information, but yet it sticks in people's minds as something positive. And most importantly, patients start calling wanting the N of 1, clinical trial. And I think we have to be honest with the patients on exactly what the chances are of them having that type of response. But having said that, we all know that there are mutations that define a phenotype that may be responsive. And just recently, we accepted a paper that was a very difficult clinical trial done across multi-center studies, looking at a very rare mutation, giving the patients a drug that in preclinical models was known to be associated with response rates. And it was a very difficult study design. It couldn't be designed like a regular phase 2 study. And we ended up taking it because that was a body of work that demonstrated there was a potential effect, and it was written in a very honest way. So it is possible, and I think important, to publish studies that are looking at molecularly targeted therapies in the appropriate patient populations in a hypothesis-generating way. I think that's good information while we learn how to use genetic phenotyping to drive therapy.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. And I think your team does a really good job at differentiating between the two examples that you gave us. I'd like to come back to the idea of dissemination as well as use of social media as a platform. Have there been conversations, or how important do you and the JAMA leadership view, or how important do you think these new platforms are to disseminate work, as well as use of podcasts or things such as journal clubs that could be perhaps online? Or do you sense that this is a work that's only limited for perhaps a small subset of your audience?
I would like to see more of our work go online, actually, because I think online things like Twitter, where people can comment in real time, where there can be a discussion of the work, helps that paper. So, for example, we talked about people not really reading the paper, just trying to get the sound bite, the take-home message. If they're engaged more, if they're watching a discussion of that paper, not only in a journal club, but just someone making a comment about a paper and then reading the replies, especially on Twitter, those can be very, very rich conversations to help you understand further what the nuances in that paper are. I would love to be on Twitter. I am intermittently, but when I go on Twitter, you end up spending the whole day on Twitter. So I have to figure out, because I love to talk about papers, I have to figure out a way that, I can manage that with everything else I do all day. But I do think that there's a role for people who spend a lot of their time on Twitter to be these leaders like Jack does continuously in terms of lung cancer, to challenge some of the papers that are coming out, making statements that are controversial in terms of the level of the data that they're showing, and really start that dialogue to get not only other clinicians involved, but patients too, to help them understand that these things aren't cut and dried. So I think Twitter and Instagram, LinkedIn, some of the newer platforms are engaging different types of people. And the more we can engage them around science and understanding science, the better everything will be. So I would like to see JAMA Oncology branch out into that area to make what's going online about our content as rich as the content itself.
Yeah, it's remarkable. Within the last year or 2 years, every journal acceptance letter is usually accompanied by an invitation to tweet about that publication, and what's your Twitter handle and what's your institution's Twitter handle. So definitely, I think there's a lot of growth in that area. Jack?
Well, I was just going to say, I think that in medicine and in science, we want to get a better sense of the impact that this has once it gets out into the world. How are people using this information, discussing it together, changing practice in an ideal world? And we can have these conversations in the hallways, but they just evaporate. And I think there's a lot of potential to learn more about the impact that these have, to leave a trace of that, a residue from the conversations we have online, can actually give a window into what people are thinking and doing with this content in the real world. I think there's a lot of potential to really capitalize on what we all do the research for. I wanted to also ask, we put information, we put links to the content on Twitter and various other platforms, and both to a professional audience and increasingly to patients. There's interest, there's engagement, but there's also a desire for getting behind the paywall. And so the question of what is the right amount of content that should be open access is, I think, a hot topic. And I'm interested in your thoughts, Nora, on what's the right balance now, and should it change, especially with publicly funded research?
Yeah. This is a very complex area, and a lot of it has to do with the business of publishing.
Yeah.
We could totally blow up the system and put everything online without review. I think that's a problem. From the number of papers that I read, there are many of them that should probably never be published, but they will be published because they'll be posted somewhere. And someone will read them who's not discerning, and especially clinical trials, of which there are many that are horrible, that may influence someone to, follow that type of regimen with their patient. So I am a big proponent of having an extensive scientific peer review of papers and, setting up a system to develop that and then put out quality papers that are readable is incredibly expensive. So who pays? Is the government going to pay for that? No. The individual journals that we all read will bear the costs of that. So now that journals are largely online, their sources of revenue are changing. Their revenues are no longer coming from ads. They're coming from libraries buying subscriptions. These online journals, the reason why they publish so many articles is they charge for you to publish your article, and they're money makers. They're money makers in a positive sense, so they're making a profit. Whereas something like our journal, we don't charge to publish unless you want your paper open access right away without our waiting period. So I think many, many more journals are going to go open access. It's going to cost us, the writers, the scientists, to publish in those journals, which is unfortunate. But that's the way it's going to go. But I do think that those journals do provide a service by publishing things that are mostly true. I can't speak for other journals other than the one I know the best, which is JAMA Network Open, our open access journal. And the peer review there is as stringent as the peer review is at JAMA Oncology. And I think that's doing an open access journal absolutely correctly. And if that's how everyone runs their journal open access, then I welcome the change.
I would love your take on this, Nora. There have been some studies that have looked at patterns of publication amongst women and they've shown that perhaps there's a real gender gap there in authorship roles for women in the first or senior author positions, especially as it relates to clinical trials. Can you talk about anything that you or other journal editors can do to ensure opportunities for women? Or do you think that these challenges are more reflective of issues beyond any role that a journal or journal editor may play?
I think the issues are pervasive. They're pervasive across all of academic medicine. So it's far beyond what a journal can do. But I think every journal needs to be aware of it. It starts really, you think about many of the big studies that changed the way we practice medicine or change standard of care, whether they come out of large cooperative groups or whether they come out of drug companies. The company looks at a person who's well-known in the field and sees a lot of patients. I mean, it's not necessarily, you developed the drug, so you're running the trial. It's kind of a choice of a panel at a company. And I do have to say, it's almost always a male that ends up being that person who's the lead on these national studies. So I think it needs to start at lots of different places. The cooperative groups need to look at how they're putting women in leadership. Companies need to look at their choices of women in leadership. And you have a system that has been very male-oriented, and you know how it is. You're sitting in a group and you're going to start a meeting and you think, well, who should be the chairperson of this committee or that committee? And people pick their friends, right? So if there's a lot of men in the room, they're going to pick their friends. That's the way a lot of leadership choices are made in academic medicine. You're going to be working on something for a year. You want to be working with someone you know and you like. And I think that we've got to break that mold. We have to start looking at diversity. I see lists. Here's a conference and here's the list of speakers, and every single one of them is a white male. There has to be someone in each organization that says that the time has got to stop for this, and start really sitting down. And when you're planning something, be it who should do this editorial or, who should be on this advisory board, to get a list of names and really look at not only gender diversity, but, racial diversity as well. I think at JAMA Oncology, we're trying to do that. We certainly, I'm a woman editor-in-chief. We've got 2 women editors as well. And we talk about that all the time when we ask for authors who should write an editorial on this, looking for younger people to try to break them into being able to write something and claim something. But I can tell you, I wish there was a place where there were lists that we'd be able to look at. Fortunately, we have Charles Thomas as one of our deputy editors, and he always seems to be able to come up with a list of, any type of person that you'd want and their full CV at a drop of a hat. So I think we have a tendency to do better than most journals because Charles has got his finger on the pulse of some database that he's able to continuously give us new, fresh faces.
Well, I think you bring up a very good point about, faculty for conferences and various committees. I hope I'm not seeming a Pollyanna, but I do think that things are getting better quickly, or at least maybe we're measuring from the bottom of the barrel, but it is getting better, that there's much more awareness questions about trying to ensure that we don't have manels of, a panel of 4 or more, a bunch of men without women representation, and with broad racial diversity, as well as age and kind of where people are in their seniority, that you don't want to tap just the same handful of people for everything all the time.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, this has been a really terrific conversation with you, Nora. We really appreciate your time, and thank you for joining us today. You can find us on iTunes or wherever you find your podcast content. We hope that you will subscribe and send us comments and feedback to beyondthejournalshow@gmail.com. We would like to thank Mark Lindsay and Talking Speaker for production and distribution support. See you in a couple of weeks with our next guest.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.